super excited about tonight's program. Each year, in partnership with the Friends of the Winchester Public Library, we sponsor a joint event. The pandemic canceled last year's event, and this year was a little bit on the shaky side, but tonight, thanks to a Mass Humanities Bridge Street grant, we are resuming our annual joint program with the library, and we have a terrific speaker as well. Nancy Cohen is a historian at the Harvard Business School, where she holds the James E. Robeson Chair of Business Administration. She has written numerous books and authored numerous Harvard Business School cases, including Starbucks and Oprah. Her latest book, Forged in Crisis: The Power of Courageous Leadership in Turbulent Times, tells the story of 5 of history's greatest leaders, Lincoln being one of them. It's an inspiring read if you have not read it, and I would highly recommend it. Nancy consults with many companies. She appears in international forums, including the World Economic Forum in Davos. You may have seen her on PBS NewsHour or Good Morning America, or potentially have read her articles in the New York Times or the Washington Post. In October 2019, Nancy spoke to a packed room at the Winchester Library, and I literally got the last chair in the room, and I was riveted the entire time. It was during that talk that she mentioned her research on Abraham Lincoln. It was clearly a topic that was near and dear to her heart. So we're very excited. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Hilda. It's a huge privilege and a great pleasure to be here on this cool, crisp, now very November evening. I'm going to do something different with this talk. This is not a presentation I've done before, and we're going to allow plenty of time for questions and answers. But I'm going to do something different here. The title is Abraham Lincoln, the Man Behind the Marble. So I thought what I'd do is talk to you less about sort of the big milestones of Lincoln's leadership. We can certainly do that in the Q&A, and I'll refer to a few of them. But I thought I'd really talk about some things you may not know about Lincoln the person, Lincoln the man, who's just as interesting and as just as rich as he is as a president, as a person, as he is as president. Complicated, funny, often depressed, imaginative, very, very kind to children and animals, passionate for a long time about his wife, didn't make many moves without her until the later years of the war. We'll talk a little bit about that. And, not necessarily always so well understood by many of us, even Lincoln fans, in terms of who he was as a person. So I thought I'd talk about that. I'm going to show you some pictures. I don't have PowerPoint bullet points, but I have some pictures. I'll put those up in a second, and then I'll talk through a little bit of using the pictures as the props. I'll talk through some of these aspects of his life in relation to his leadership. I'm not going to ignore that. That's been the subject of my historian's lens for a long, long time. And Lord knows we could use a little of his leadership right now. We can certainly talk about that as much as you want in the Q&A. So let me put some slides up. I'm going to run the slides here, folks. So bear with me. What we're going to do, as you'll see in a second, is a little bit different than some Zoom presentations, but it takes a second for my computer to bring it up on Zoom. So don't think we've lost it here. We're on it. It's just going to take a second for it to load up here on the Zoom screen. And I'll be with you here as we do this. So just a sec. And then we'll launch into this. And if I'm not going to be looking at chat because I'll be kind of thinking and speaking to you, but Electra and Hilda and folks will be looking at chat. So if you have burning issues in chat, please bring them up. They'll come forward in the Q&A as filtered by these 2 wise women. All right, so you know the title. Let's move on to the first shot. Here's a Daniel Chester French's famous Lincoln Memorial, done many, many years after Lincoln died, from a series of photographs as likenesses that he then made into a relatively small relatively small bust that was then cast in marble, and then made in marble by actually a different set of sculptors that he used for most of his statuary. This is what we know as Lincoln. I'm going to try, and I try to do this to a certain extent in Forged in Crisis. So if you haven't seen the story, it's a storybook, this book, about 5 leaders, and how they made themselves capable of doing something impossible from the inside out. So it has a great deal to say about their emotional experience and their emotional growth and their, vulnerabilities and humanity and their tragedies and losses and stumbles as well as their victories. This is what we know, and this is what I'm trying to pull us out of here in terms of thinking about Lincoln. Most of you know he was born in 1809 to what we call hardscrabble parents, meaning relatively poor farmers in central Kentucky. I'm going to show you pictures and say something about both of the most important parents to him. His father, Thomas Lincoln, this is he later in life, he died in 1851, was a principled but largely ignorant man in terms of reading and writing in the larger world. Lincoln and he, from a young age, Lincoln and his father were like ships going in different directions. They clashed often, they clashed intently. Thomas Lincoln didn't like his young son's book interests, his kind of, walking and doing farm work and getting lost in thought and stopping behind the plow, his sensitivity to animals. Lincoln shot a turkey when he was age 8 on the frontier. Remember, boys on the frontier were expected to hunt and kill and animals, right? That was the food source, very important, as part of becoming into manhood. Lincoln fired on a turkey, killed it, and never ever shot at an animal again. He said it was so scarring for him at the time. His father couldn't stand that. He didn't understand this bookish, thoughtful, son who was always interested in borrowing something to read or writing on, a piece of wood with charcoal as a way of, opening his mind, bettering his writing skills, etc. And they clashed. When Thomas Lincoln was very ill in an illness that would kill him in 1851 in Eastern Illinois, Lincoln was then living in Springfield, in the central, slightly southern part of the state, about a carriage and about a day and a half's carriage ride away. Lincoln, when he got notice of it from his cousin, said he wouldn't go to his bedside. Tell my father it should be more troubling for both of us than if I went than if I stayed home. And so that really said a great deal about Lincoln's long-time sense of his intimacy with his father. When he turns 21, he basically can't wait to get away from him. So a man partly defined, Lincoln, partly defined by making tracks, gaining distance on his father. Now, this is his stepmother, his mother, his birth mother, Nancy Hanks, was a beautiful woman. We have a painting of her that I can't reproduce for rights reasons. We have no photograph. She also could not read or write. Thomas Lincoln may have been able to sign his name and maybe a little bit more, but not much. But she died when Lincoln was 9 years old of milk sickness, and that was a scarring event, just an absolutely searing event for her son and his older sister, Sarah, who was 2 years older. And Lincoln, said at a few points, he was not someone who availed himself of emotional release in verbal form. But he said a couple of points that that what this had meant, and that it was very, very difficult. After a year in 1818, after a year of living without a wife on the frontier with 2 young kids, Thomas Lincoln was done with this, and he hightailed it back to Kentucky to marry a woman. This is she in the photograph, Sarah Bush Johnston, who was a widow. He had known her. They had courted briefly before they had each married other people. And she came with a couple of children, so they would be stepbrothers, to Lincoln, and a small amount of cash and a household of furniture and a great big organized approach to raising children and running a household on the frontier. She was loving. She was disciplined. She was again very careful with how she kept the house clean and well stocked and the kids well clothed. And Lincoln, right now, a year away from his mother's death and antagonistic toward his father, took to her, right, with his, 10 years old, with a big open heart and just very, very thirsty for her love. And they became quite close. She was always most appreciative of Lincoln's intellectual abilities, of his thirst for knowledge, of his wish to go to school. She was the one who talked Thomas Lincoln into, on 3 separate occasions, allowing his son to actually go to a schoolhouse some many miles away, which we'll talk about in 1 second. So she was an incredibly important and loving influence on Lincoln all of his life. His 2 most important leave takings when he wins the presidency in 1860, before he goes to Washington, his 2 most important leave takings are first to travel to Eastern Illinois and see her and talk to her and spend 2 days with her. And she reminds him that her husband, his father, his headstone needs to be replaced. And Lincoln promises to do that, and of course does not, because he doesn't like his father. And he said many times in his life, all I've ever become, I owe to my dear mother. And he meant Sarah Bush Johnston. His second leave taking, by the way, was to his longtime law partner, William Herndon, who he had spent almost 18 years with in law practice, and who he considered a kind of protege is not the right word, but a dear friend and something of a surrogate son, although Herndon was a lot older than Lincoln's children. Now Lincoln's schooling. Here's a collage of some of Lincoln's notebooks that he kept as a student. It's really important to remember that Lincoln had less than a year of formal schooling. So arguably our greatest writer as president, right? Perhaps our most eloquent writer reader's the wrong word, writer and speaker as president, or certainly one of the top 2 or 3, right, had less than a year of formal schooling. And that's because Lincoln was enormously self-taught, and not in a kind of Renaissance way, right? He's not, George Will or some of the chattering class intellectuals that are really interested in a kind of, integrated and broad look at the humanities and the arts and politics and other disciplines. Lincoln taught himself what he needs to know on a need-to-know basis, in a very surgical strike, pull the information in, convert it to understanding, use it to make wise choices. He was extremely adept at teaching himself what he wanted to know, from retailing when he's a young man trying to build a career, to the law when he studies law in his early 30s, to military strategy when he gets to the White House and has no generals that won't fight. So Lincoln knew how to teach himself, and that's, I think, something really important for all of us today when we have all kinds of complicated relationships with information sources, and mostly what we're doing is reacting rather than pulling information in and converting it to knowledge and understanding. This is New Salem. I'm not going to say a huge amount about this here. This was a village north of Springfield, where Lincoln would eventually settle, some ways west of where he had left his parents in Eastern Illinois, where he spent 7 incredibly important years. In between the ages of about 21, a little later than 21. He was really brushing 22 when he arrived, all the way into his very early 30s. And he came with no cash and no connections, awkward, really a product of the frontier. And by the time he left, he was a state legislator, having been elected to the Illinois state legislature 3 times. He was well on his way to becoming a lawyer. He was well versed in Shakespeare. He had learned public speaking. He had perhaps tasted romance. That's a subject of some controversy and uncertainty in terms of the record, with a woman, with a woman in this village, and Rutledge, and he was well on his way to really being a rising man, something that was so very, very important for the rest of his life until he got to the presidency, and he'd risen that high, and now there was an incredible amount of work to be done at that place, in that place. I don't think there's anything, I don't think I want to say anything else about Lincoln's Here's what I want to tell you about Lincoln personally in New Salem. So this is the beginning of some friendships for Lincoln. Lincoln was a person who held his emotional cards all his life very, very close to his chest. He's not a natural politician in that sense. He could tell stories. He was happy to, meet the public, but he wasn't someone who thrived on extroverted energy or on close connections with people. Quite the opposite. He was guarded. He was circumspect with a lot of people. Let's put it this way. A whole lot of people, maybe hundreds, considered themselves Lincoln's friends over the years in Illinois. I would say Lincoln probably had, and Lincoln would corroborate this, had only 5 or 6 friends. So what it felt like to be on the outside from Lincoln was very different from what Lincoln experienced in terms of intimacy. But very interestingly, a couple of important things start to surface in New Salem that will characterize other patterns in Lincoln's life. The first one is that after Anne Rutledge dies, probably of consumption, but it could have been typhoid, late in his time there, he's so morose by it. He was good friends with her, it's clear. It's not clear that there was a real romance there, certainly not from him to her. Although historians have argued about it endlessly for 150 years. But after she died, he was so depressed that he took to his bed, and his friends, he had a number of couples. He was single, couples that kind of took him in, men that respected his intelligence, women that respected his intelligence, and just thought he was a loving and soul who needed their care, took him in, took his razors away because they were worried he might do harm to himself, and basically kept trying to, kind of pick him up and send him back on his way. And over about 6 or 8 weeks, he got well enough to go back to the state legislature and go back to work. But he was very debilitated. And Lincoln suffered from what today we would call, all his life, chronic depression. He called it bouts of melancholy or the hypo. And, it's very clear, like lots and lots of people who suffer from depression. I have it in my family, although I've not suffered from it. But it's very clear that he found a way over time to harness it, to spend less and less time in the canyons, and actually to build resilience, right, in its midst that served him extremely well as president. Here's his law office. So when Lincoln is 30 years and a few months, he heads to Springfield as a lawyer. He's been encouraged. He studied for the bar. He studied for the bar. He's going to take a bar exam when he gets to Springfield. He's been encouraged to come to Springfield by several colleagues that he met in the state legislature, and then he met that have passed through New Salem. And he's excited about this. He's excited about the chance to get into a wider throng of politics and commerce and possibility. He spends 4 years working for senior partners, for 2 different senior partners, both of whom teach him a lot, because he starts off as a very sloppy lawyer. This is something interesting to know about Lincoln too. He was a lot like college students, right? He would procrastinate when he had a trial, and then the 2 days before the trial, he would cram like crazy to figure out what the case was about and what he would present on behalf of his client to the jury. And he started out really sloppily, not just in terms of the organization of his work as a lawyer, as a trial lawyer. He handled all kinds of cases, everything from murder to divorce to, whose fence belongs where on the frontier to, what's the price that cow was supposed to sell for, and why are we disputing that? And he became a very good lawyer, but he started off really sloppy and very much kind of leaning on these powers of storytelling he had. And it really took these senior partners, John Stewart and in the first case, and another older gentleman, to kind of smack some sense into him, like Olivia Dukakis in Moonstruck. Snap out of it, Abe. Snap out of it. And he did. And he stopped relying on making fun of his opponent or just telling a story and winning over the kind of goodwill of the jury, and started concentrating on this. So I want to offer this to you from Lincoln. It's less about his personal life than I think about the way he trained his powers of observation and focus, which is something we all need right now. Powers of observation about what's going on in the big wide world, and focus on what's really happening and what matters for each of us and our roles. And he trained himself to focus, and he later said this in the law lecture in the late 1850s before he ran for president. He said, I learned that if I could win the jury's approval on the three fundamental aspects of a case, every case hinged on one, two, or three fundamental points, never more, right? If I could win the jury to my client's point of view on those three fundamental points, I could win the entire case while giving everything else away to my opponent and therefore disarming him. And if you think about that, it's an astounding statement of negotiation skills, right? It says you don't need to win everything. We need to win the three key things, or the one, two, or three things, or one, two, or two key things. And you can literally give everything else away. So there's that interesting, right, canny, right, conclusion that Lincoln comes to. There's the confidence underneath that, right? I do a lot of leadership coaching with all kinds of high achieving people, from doctors to leaders of foundations to business executives. And most of these high achieving people are highly controlling, and they think they need to win everything. They need to get it right on every single cylinder. And I just want to say, no. Some things are much more important than others. Give everything else away. Either let it go or give someone else it to deal with. But you only need to concentrate on the one, two, or three things. This is true for everyone, that are mission critical to you and that only you can do. And Lincoln's saying that there. So he's speaking about negotiation and winning over a jury, but he's also talking about focus and what we should be spending our time and energy on. Canny, smart. This is his law office. Okay, so now back to personal. This is his law office in Springfield that he had with his third partner, William Herndon. He was much younger than Lincoln, very, very polished. I mean, Lincoln, we'll come back to Lincoln's dishevelment before he became president, but very polished, very urbane, very connected in Whig circles, which was the party that Lincoln started his political career in. And so Lincoln wasn't just choosing a law partner, he was choosing a political asset to him, because he was always interested in political ascendance. Everything had a political piece to it for Lincoln throughout his life, until, again, he ends up in the presidency, right? When God wants to punish you, he answers your prayers. So he chooses Herndon, and Herndon and he for 18 years carry on what becomes a very successful law practice. And Lincoln makes money, real money, compared to what anything like his father could have envisioned. Lincoln was never motivated by money. He understood it. He was careful with it. He did not hesitate to threaten to sue people that didn't pay their bills. He understood its value. He also understood its political importance. And there are good records, even though historians almost never of Lincoln never study his legal career. A couple have. And their work is really important, because it's interesting how he priced his cases. Like, he never, ever charged exorbitant fees to individuals. It was almost as if he could see that if he rose to high public prominence, no one would ever be able to say that Lincoln, in a sense, was collecting, monopoly rents or unrealistic prices or gouging his fellow citizens on the frontier. He's very, very careful. On the other hand, he made a good deal of money, and when he represented big business interests, as he did in the McCormick Reaper Company in the late 1850s, he didn't hesitate to keep his rates, commensurate with what the market would bear. So this is their law office. It was much messier then. This is in Springfield, opposite the old state capitol. There's Lincoln's top hat. You can see on the desk, there was a huge pile of papers here on the left side of the photograph, with a little rock on the top of it, because Lincoln was things were messy. He knew the mess, but they were messy. And there's a little rock on it, a note under the rock that said, if you can't find it anywhere else, look for it here. And in a chaotic environment characterized by his young boys running around with spitballs, toys and scooters and, just basic, very undisciplined behavior. Business was conducted here in a very kind of, commercially successful way over time. Half the year, Lincoln was on the circuit, riding the 8th Circuit of Illinois, traveling just as outside of cities and large towns came to the people, right, for several days, like every quarter or every season. And Lincoln would ride the circuit with a number of lawyers, a few of whom did become friends. And there are wonderful vignettes from other lawyers about Lincoln on the circuit. And let me give you a couple of them. So Lincoln was a very good horseman. That's also not known. And he would, and the roads were flooded, he would not hesitate to, kind of jump off his horse, put his clothes on the top of his head with his valises and saddlebags over his shoulders, and kind of swim his horse across to the other side. He was known for stopping if he saw an animal in distress. I'm going to come back to animals in a second because this is something that's not known about Lincoln at all. And it was with him all his life. And he would stop, pick a nest up from the road and put the nest and the eggs back in the tree, or release the squealing piglet from the mud. Now, he took a lot of riffing on this kind of behavior from his fellow lawyers, but he never stopped doing it. So just interesting, right? Just interesting. Right? Stop. We're gonna save this pig, or I'm gonna save this pig. Stop. We're gonna stop this fight. He once encountered a bunch of boys trying to kill a turtle. Now we're gonna stop this. This is not gonna happen. Really interesting in a time when that was just not what men on the frontier did. Okay, let me move on. This is my favorite portrait of Lincoln. This is a portrait taken in mid-1854, in the mid-1850s. I like it because I think it's so characteristic of the Mr. Lincoln I know. His hair was always that disheveled until he got to the White House. He was just I was thinking of The Odd Couple the other day because I saw this little photograph of Felix Unger, the character in that television series, and I was thinking of, Oscar Madison. I mean, Lincoln was a little Oscar Madison-like, his disheveled, disorganized roommate. His pants were often too short. His hair, that's not, kind of expensive men's hair care products in his hair. That's how his hair looked. His suits always didn't fit him very well until he started having them made at Brooks Brothers when he was elected president. And yet, he always thought of himself as ugly. And yet here, he looks thoughtful. You can see that almost the dreamy eyes. This is something that drove his wife crazy at times because he would just, and his companions on the 8th Circuit, they'd be having a conversation and Lincoln would just lose himself in a thought and he'd just disappear, right? In terms of his energy, his presence, his attention, happened all the time. And you see that here, right? The thoughtful gaze outward, lost in his thoughts. I think a handsome profile, although he always thought he was ugly. When he was, and that's part of what made him shy around women. He was always shy around women. And his manners, he always thought, suffered from not having been raised in a more metropolitan place than, central Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky. When he was debating Stephen Douglas in 1858 for the Republican seat, the Senate seat, he was running as a Republican, but for the Senate seat from Illinois, the U.S. Senate seat, there's one moment in one of the later debates, or 8 debates, when Douglas accuses him of being two-faced with some legitimacy, because Lincoln would say much more progressive things about slavery and its need to end it and halt its spread in northern Illinois, which was a more progressive, more abolitionist-leaning part of the state, and more conservative things he would say in the southern part of the state. He would say, "You're two-faced about this." And Lincoln would say, "Two-faced? If I was two-faced, do you think I would possibly wear this one?" I mean, lots and lots of that kind of, he was just funny, but lots and lots of that kind of self-deprecation about his looks. And when he first gets to Springfield and begins, along with several other young lawyers, many like Stephen Douglas at the time, who was going to rise much more quickly than Lincoln in state and national politics, when they begin going to social occasions where it was known there would be young single women, Lincoln just holds back. He stands back. He's a little awkward, but he's got this gentleness and this rough chivalry that I think appealed to all kinds of people, particularly women, all his life. I think that's why those women in New Salem kind of scooped him up and put him under their arm and took care of him and fed him, and took care of him when he was ill, et cetera, or when he was suffering as he was after Anne Rutledge died. So interesting, this interesting set of pocket of diffidence about his appearance. And again, he really addresses that without any fanfare when he becomes president. It's clear he thinks, I need to look different, it needs to be different. And I need to show up in a different way. And indeed he did, although his secretaries, these two men that were important confidants in the White House, John Nicolay and John Hay, have told many, many stories, and they write about this in their 9-volume biography of Lincoln, about him walking the halls at night, pacing when he couldn't sleep in a long nightshirt and long, spindly white legs that stuck out like stilts underneath him. And just, hardly looking kind of, all packaged up and neat, really, really, again, disheveled. So let me leave that at this and go on to Mary Todd. So this is a portrait of Mary Todd painted about the time she and Lincoln got married in the mid 1840s. She was 5'1", he was 6'4". He used to say, I guess we're about the long and the short of it. And she was really smart and really, really vivacious and well educated for a woman of her time. She came from a slave-owning family in Lexington, Kentucky. And she had dinner with all kinds of luminaries at the dinner table because her father was really well connected in Kentucky politics, including Henry Clay, who was someone that Lincoln idolized. And I think there was a very strong physical chemistry between them from the beginning. And they had a complicated roller coaster courtship, which we don't need to go into. But let me tell you what they shared. Say a little bit about their marriage and a little bit about his role as a husband. They shared 3 really important things that were defining for both of them. The first one was politics, and particularly his career. She was as ambitious, perhaps more so at some times, for his career as he was. And she did a lot of picking him up and dusting him off when he was despondent or in the wake of a political loss, and pushing him out the door. And I don't think there's any question he would ever have been president, but for Mary Todd. That's not saying anything massively new about a lot of male leaders and perhaps some female leaders, but she's really an important piece of this. Until Willie's death, their second son to die, who died in the middle of the war in February of 1862, until that drove her into a kind of paroxysm of grief, he didn't make a decision without her ever. She was like his political, intelligence machine, and he trusted her. And at the very end of the war, you see this in Spielberg's movie Lincoln, which is fantastic. Daniel Day-Lewis is the president, and Sally Field is Mary Todd. You see a little bit of that when he asks her advice around getting the votes for the 13th Amendment, which is the focus of the movie. Anyway, they shared politics. They shared their children. They loved their children passionately. They had 4 sons: Robert Todd Lincoln, Edward Lincoln, who died in Springfield, Willie, Lincoln's favorite, who looked the most like Lincoln, and then Tad, Thomas Lincoln, named for Lincoln's father, the last child. Those 2 boys died about almost 10 years apart, about 11 years apart, and which was very, very hard on both parents, terribly hard on both parents. And they loved their kids, and they were completely undisciplined. Lincoln once said, we think love are the ties that bind, not discipline. So in an age when kids were whipped and grounded and all kinds of disciplinary measures enforced for children being polite and courteous, Lincoln's kids were, according to lots and lots of colleagues and friends, absolute brats, and they encouraged it and reveled in their children's energy. It was not uncommon to walk into the White House, into Lincoln's office or the second floor of the White House. There was no West Wing until Teddy Roosevelt built it in the early 20th century, and find Lincoln rolling around on the floor with his boys and some friends they'd invited in. So very active, very encouraging, very loving parents, all of them. By the way, Mary Todd's mother had died when she was just around the age of Lincoln, so they shared that. And perhaps that was part of why they had shared this philosophy of the way they raised their children. The third thing that they shared was, I think, and this isn't this isn't terribly well documented or written about. I think they had a very important physical chemistry between them from the get-go. And there's a little bit of evidence about that sexually, just a little bit. It's not terribly good. Carl Sandburg's folks, his research assistants dug it up in the early 20th century when Sandburg was following all kinds of detective clues. But there's a little bit more than that. And I think it was a really important source of the marital cohesion, because they could fight like cats and dogs. He was a difficult husband. She was a difficult wife. He was uncouth. I mean, when guests would come to the door at their Springfield house, which they expanded and renovated, Lincoln's fortunes rose, and Mary's sense of her place in society rose as his husband. People would knock at the door and for Mary, and he would say, well, she'll be right down. She's just getting her trotting harness on. And for Mary, race was servant slaves. In Lexington, Kentucky, this wasn't really how you did it with guests. He would lie in front of the fire and read. And she'd say, dinner's ready. Father, they called each other mother and father-in-law. And he would just ignore her because he was lost in his book. I think she got very, very insecure about money at times because it ran short. And she was responsible for making the house, even though he made the money, she was responsible for making the ends meet. She got very, very insecure about her own position in society, both in Washington particularly, but also in Springfield. And when he couldn't assuage that, her temper would often rise, and then he would be at a loss as to what to do. He'd often leave the house. So they had plenty of conflict. But the scores and scores of historians in the late 19th and early 20th century that wanted to write Mary off do a great disservice to the record. She's essential. They had a marriage that had a great deal of cohesion, and I think they both really respected and cared deeply about each other throughout. Lincoln was a family man, and we always forget that. He was a family man who drew great comfort from his kids and his wife all the way through, particularly the perfect storm of the Civil War. Here's Exhibit A to that. This is Lincoln reading to Tad in 1864. So he spent a lot of time with his children in the White House. The boys, Willie and Tad, were boys. Robert was off to boarding school and then Harvard through the war. But he was very, very close. It was not uncommon, as you see in the Spielberg movie, for him to pick Tad up off the sofa in the study and carry him to bed. Because he was with his children a great deal, even in the press of the war. Now, this is Fido. Fido was the Lincoln dog in Springfield. When he won the presidency, he gave Fido away to the neighbors. Boys were just very upset. He also carried over the horsehair sofa across the street with Fido that Fido liked to sleep on, and they kept that, and the neighbors kept that. The kids had some pets in the White House. They had a goat. Tad had a goat. Willie had a pony. In 1864, and Lincoln had horses that he rode for exercise and stress reduction. In 1864, the White House stable burned. We don't know exactly how. Lincoln saw it from the window of the White House, raced down and couldn't get in. The fires were burning so intensely. He couldn't get in and save the horses. And four of the horses, all four horses, I think it was four, might have been six, burned, terrible death. And Lincoln, the stable master who was eating at the time, Lincoln called him when he saw the flames, came out and found Lincoln with his face in his hands just weeping, because Willie, who was dead, had been dead for 2 years, his beloved son, his pony had died. Lincoln always very kind to animals, always interested in them. Seward, his Secretary of State, gave him a passel of kittens in the middle of the war. And Lincoln became incredibly close to them, carried them around the White House, stroked them as they became cats, right? Really loved those pets. This is Lincoln outside his house. He's come a long way from the log cabin in 1860 after he's won the Republican nomination. He's actually the person right in the center to the right of the doorframe in a white suit. This is just to kind of move the story along. This is the first inauguration. Lincoln's under that square framing in the front of the Capitol. you'll notice that the Capitol dome is not completed. There is no dome. And one of Lincoln's first acts of authorization, there was actually a tweet about this recently from Michael Beschloss, the leader historian of the presidency, who was pointing out that some of Lincoln's most important acts were infrastructure building in the wake of Joe Biden's Build Back Better law being passed. And one of Lincoln's first acts was to authorize funding to complete the Capitol, and then later, in the early part of the war, in the early part of his presidency, to authorize funding to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. He saw both of those things as critical infrastructure, right, investments, but they were also critical symbols of the president's belief in the middle of a civil war that you had to have people believe in the future, see the future. And a dome on the Capitol and a Transcontinental Railroad spoke to the persistence and the stability of the Union that would stay together. So there were political signaling issues there that Lincoln was knowledgeable of. This is the White House in 1862 with Union soldiers drilling on the East Lawn. This is Lincoln's study. If you've seen the Spielberg movie, it's been built the set was built painstakingly in accordance with primary source accounts of this room. Lincoln lived here. It was in the middle of the second floor of the White House. There were maps of the war all over the room. He didn't take his breakfast here. He got up very early, didn't sleep well. Lincoln had terrible insomnia through the war, and the press, I think, of the business of the storm, the weight literally on his shoulders. And he used to, by the way, as stress reduction, he used to walk the halls at night. I alluded to this earlier when I was talking about his pajamas or his nightshirt, and sing bawdy Scottish ballads or tell really raunchy jokes. He was a master of the raunchy joke. Jokes that we would be aghast if our teenage sons told them today. Really raunchy jokes, and he enjoyed them and he reveled in that humor. But he would often arrive here first thing, before the sun had risen, to work, think, write, plan a conversation with the general. The War Department was just across the street where there was a telegraph. And then he would rise for breakfast. He ate very, very simply. No one knows this. Lincoln weighed 185 pounds at 6'4" when he became president. He lost almost 30 pounds as president. He used to say, just don't have much appetite. I just push my victuals around on my plate without eating them. And I think that was nerves. But he ate very simply, right? An egg and coffee for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch with a piece of fruit. He loved apples. Sometimes an afternoon snack, but not usually, black coffee. Didn't really drink tea, didn't really touch alcohol, a little bit in friends game, but very, very rarely. Lots of cold water, lots of black coffee. Hydrate and take the water out of you with the coffee. And then at dinner, vegetable, meat, potatoes. When they lived in Springfield, Mary did all the cooking, and he loved corn cakes and he loved pancakes, and he would just eat them right off the griddle as she made them. He also loved apple pie, her apple pie. And when they got to the White House, she made sure that her recipe was what was being served, and they ate it for dessert all the time because Lincoln loved it so much. But so mornings in his study. Then time with his family at breakfast, always, and then meetings. Often to the War Department, there was a battle going on to get the latest information from the telegraph. On Tuesdays and Friday afternoons, he met his cabinet around that table. He had office hours. Anyone could see the president from basically 9 to 12, give or take. Every weekday, you could line up outside the White House. There's no Secret Service because they wouldn't come into being until after Lincoln was assassinated. And you could line up and see the president. All kinds of people came, from everything from my son needs a pardon for this, for this conviction, this military infraction, to I've got a new gun I want you to buy for the Union Army, to we need to get our we used to have the right to this toll booth on this Ohio road, and we need to get it back. It was taken from us by the last mayor of the town. And Lincoln's secretaries were constantly nagging him to stop this. It's a waste of time and energy. And he said, absolutely not. They're my public opinion bags. I need to see the people. And then he wrote his speeches. You can't see the corner of the room, but there was a standing desk where he wrote all his own speeches. This is Lincoln's cabinet. This is a painting done in 18 1863, and it's Lincoln reading the Emancipation Proclamation, which he had drafted in the summer of 1862, to some, not all of his cabinet members, who many of you know were initially fairly rivalrous with the new president. They competed with him for offices. They knew him to be much less accomplished than they as politicians. And so he came into office, assembled purposely a group of people that had connections, that had experiences, that had knowledge that he did not have, right? It is, as Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote in her group biography of these people, it was a team of rivals, but Lincoln wins them over. Over time, he wins almost all of them over. And he does it by competence and by, I think, integrity and by largely seriousness of purpose. The gentleman on the left, I want to read you something just to give you a sense of Lincoln and his understanding of people and his humor. Well, the gentleman on the left is Edwin Stanton. It was his Secretary of War. They formed a really tight, really important partnership during the war. So again, think back to Lincoln, the man behind the marble. Think of the self-confidence at some deep level he accessed to put this group of people together. People he knew that would initially look down on him because they considered him, an inexperienced, right, uncouth frontiersman from what was then the West, Illinois. So the gentleman on the left is Edwin Stanton. He was a lawyer, a well-known lawyer. He had served in the Buchanan administration. Lincoln had met him in the 1850s when they were on the same side as counsel for the McCormick Harvesting or Reaper Company. Stanton took one look at Lincoln and said, "This is a long-armed ape. What's he doing in this courtroom?" Lincoln, who had a real ability to push things away, personal insults, and let them go, forgave him that or overlooked that and chose Stanton because he was clean and serious. His first Secretary of War had been a disaster, corrupt, Simon Cameron, and he chose him in 1862, early 1862, to be Secretary of War. He was brilliant. He was careful. He was organized. He was efficient. He was an extraordinary administrator. Fast partnership formed. Here's what he said. I just want to read you what he said about Stanton just shortly after he appointed him. He said, I'm reading this from Forging Crisis. As time passed, the two men grew to like and respect each other, forging one of the strongest administrative partnerships in U.S. history. Impressed with his new cabinet members' remarkable reserves of energy, Lincoln once compared him to a Methodist minister whose sermons were so high-spirited that congregation members wanted to put bricks in his pockets to hold him down. Lincoln said, "We may be obliged to serve Stanton exactly the same way, but I guess we'll just let him jump around a while first." Just again, this sense of, in the person, the humor, the self-confidence to move forward with someone who's right for the job. And I won't go through the rest of these people. Except to say, here's Seward, the guy who gave him the kitten, sitting in the foreground of the picture. They had also been rivals for the Republican nomination in 1860. Seward came to form a great sense of respect for Lincoln. I'm going to kind of cut short things here. These are photographs of Gettysburg. I don't want to talk too much about the war because there's lots of good personal stuff, but let's move on in the interest of questions. I do want to say two things here. This is the Gettysburg Cemetery laid out. You all remember the Gettysburg Address given in mid-November 1863 as a dedication to that cemetery. The speech was less than 3 minutes long. This is a photograph of Lincoln. He's over the number 2 here, taken as he stepped down from the dais from giving his speech. There are no photographs of Lincoln giving one of the most famous speeches in American history because the photographer, thinking the speech was going to be long, right, much longer than 3 minutes, was still setting up the tripod while Lincoln was speaking. So we only have the couple of blurred photographs of Lincoln off the dais. One other thing I want to say about the Gettysburg Address, and this is about Lincoln behind the marble. I think, having spent years with Mr. Lincoln and feeling like I really do, and this is an audacious thing to say given the world of Lincoln scholarship, like I know the man behind the marble. I really do feel that. I think what the Gettysburg Address the reason it's so powerful is I think it came from a really tortured place in Lincoln. He could not understand why this battle in which 55,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing after 3 days of fighting, 55,000, my friends, right? He could not, a single battle, he could not understand why the war hadn't ended. He couldn't understand in the wake of the carnage of this particular battle. There were lots of terrible battles, but this one he thought was going to be a turning point. He couldn't understand why the war went on. And I think what came out of that, the reason that speech is so powerful is because he's partly leading himself, coaching himself to say, this is where we came from as a nation. This is what we're fighting for. These are the stakes. Here's what the job of we the living is, even in the face of all these men who we vow will not have died in vain. I think he had to figure it out and talk himself into, right, the mission of the war and the costs of the war as he lays it out so extraordinarily in the Gettysburg Address. That's just math on the war. Let me move my head. The little cell at the bottom right is the number killed, number total of casualties, deaths and wounded, and that's about 3% of the American population in 1865. So make that 9 or 10 million people a day, about 10 million people. Even with our COVID deaths, terrible deaths. That's still a much smaller number than 10 million, which is the proportionate number. I'm going to pause, or I want to say something at the end, but let's take some questions. I've spoken for a while here. Let's take some questions. And I want to say something at the very end here that I think is important about Lincoln behind the marble. And let me get this. I'll get the slides off here. Okay.
So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself in the bottom left and go right ahead and ask the question.
So this Electra, I do have a question. You talked quite a bit about Lincoln's political aspirations and how it was a part of what he was doing from a fairly young age. What was he being driven by? It didn't sound like it was money or power. What do you think was driving that?
Well, he's pretty candid about it in his first public speech when he first runs at the grand old age of 21 for state legislature. Incidentally, Lincoln said, Electra, Lincoln's law partner, Herndon, who knew him, said Lincoln's ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. So very ambitious. I think he was ambitious, and he says this, for public recognition as a politician. I think it's a little bigger than what we call, narcissistic gratification. There's some of that. It switches to something bigger and more powerful when he becomes the steward of the country in the midst of a civil war, as it does for lots of good leaders. It stops being about me and starts being about we or you, thou. But I think for a long, long time it was, I want to be recognized as a player on the field of public affairs. And by the way, I need to be a good steward on that. It wasn't, I need to be president or senator at any cost. I need to be standing in a grounded place of decency and be doing that. And of course, decency is influenced and affected by political reality. Right? You're always a good calculator about what the politics of the moment demanded, but very thoughtful about the integrity with which he did the things he did, including his position on slavery, beginning very publicly in about 1854.
Thank you.
Anne, Anne Connolly, did I see your hand up?
Yes, you did. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, I've watched actually some of your case studies that you, I think, bring students alongside. And I'm just kind of wondering your own interest in Lincoln. Where has it come from? Was it like something that just kind of ticked that off? Because obviously your passion comes through massively, and it's really, really encouraging.
No, I'm pretty passionate about the people. I'm actually working, believe it or not, folks, on a group biography of 3 Black American civil rights leaders. And they are going to teach us lessons. I mean, there's a whole lot of lessons in fortune and crisis that these people learn themselves, and they can teach us today. I got a whole new extraordinary set with these extraordinary leaders in an amazing crisis that actually connects directly back to Lincoln and Frederick Douglass in my own kind of, if you will, journey as a detective. Here's the thing, Anne. And this is personal. Nancy behind the marble, or Nancy behind the HBS business card. My life fell apart in big hunky blocks. That's a That's a line by Sylvia Plath. Beginning in 2002, my dad dropped dead. His brain stopped. His heart stopped working. He was brain dead immediately at the kitchen table at 72. My mother then collapsed. She was a very fragile person, dependent on my father. A few months after that, my sister and I began caring for her. A few months after that, my husband, to whom I've been married, ex-husband, who I've been married 15 years, announced one February day, I don't love you anymore. I'm leaving. My lawyer will call you about the Harvard retirement. And then about a year later, I got cancer for the first time. And then there was a very, very messy, complicated divorce. It lasted 3 years. Then there was a second round, much more aggressive, of cancer. And even before cancer, right? The wake of my father's death, my mother, my ex-husband, whom I loved very dearly at the time, I couldn't sleep. I lost 20 pounds in 20 days. I was fighting for a different kind of survival in the wake of that shock and awe. And one night, not so long after some of these big dominoes started dropping, I couldn't sleep. I know about insomnia. I didn't sleep for a year, much more than 2 hours a night. I picked up, I still have the book in my bedroom bookshelf here in Concord. I picked up the modern library edition of Lincoln's collected writings. It's one volume. Lincoln's collected volumes fill 10 volumes, collected writings. But this is a very, very carefully edited. And I started reading from the back, and from 1865 backwards. And I kept, as the more I learned, I didn't know anything about Lincoln. I was trained as a European historian, early modern European historian. The more I learned about Lincoln, the more I thought, holy moly, Nancy, you think you got problems. This guy had bigger problems, a lot bigger problems. How did he figure out how to keep going and get so good? And then and greedily, selfishly, I thought, what can I learn? And that was the beginning of this really intense, incredible immersion in Lincoln for about 10 years.
Okay.
He has a lot to teach us. He has a lot to teach us, just an enormous amount. And
it's almost like, it's almost like he came along, or, in some way came along at the right time for you as well.
He did. I think all these people did. Rachel Carson is a story in my book, a guy named Frederick Douglass, Ernest Shackleton, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And someone said to me as I was describing these stories and how I stumbled on them, here's what she said. She's a horse person. I ride horses. I took up horseback riding after my life started falling apart. But I thought, I'll just master horseback riding and that'll make me feel okay about myself. Oh boy, the naivete of that just knocks me down. But anyway, the wrongness and the naivete. Anyway, she said, it's almost like your job is to be a kind of vehicle, voice for these leaders. And like you were put in the path to tell stories about people that lots of people have studied, but no one has told these stories. And no one has. There's nothing, everything in that book is so original. It rests on historical research. But what I'm doing with what these people learned about themselves to help other people access their stronger self is absolutely and utterly brand new. And I think that's what happened. I think Lincoln was put on my path to help me. And then I was to take that and offer it to the world and say, what can you use here, good person?
Yeah, thank you.
Ditto for these civil rights leaders. I hope I can do that I hope I can do justice to their bravery and their integrity and their extraordinary ingenuity.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the relationship Lincoln had with Frederick Douglass and the influence they had on each other?
Great question. Thank you for I don't think it's a plant, but thank you for the question. So they met 3 times. So let's briefly, I'll try and be brief. Frederick Douglass, as soon as Lincoln was nominated, as soon as Lincoln became a national figure, which he did in the 1858 debates with Stephen Douglas, because they were covered as a national event by newspapers, Frederick Douglass was very doubtful and skeptical of Lincoln. Lincoln, he thought, was satisficing I'm saying the Republican Party's position is to stop the expansion of slavery. It's not to end slavery. And Frederick Douglass was the leading abolitionist in the country and the most important single person ultimately in generating the political capital on the ground with ordinary citizens, with the press, with lots and lots of Northern politicians that Lincoln needed to have enough capital to issue the Emancipation Proclamation to promulgate it in the fall of 1862. So Douglass is essential to Lincoln's most important act as president, which is to set slavery on its dramatic course to extinction. But Douglas hated Lincoln. He thought he was weak. He thought he was a compromiser. A lot of abolitionists did, because he wasn't going far enough. Lincoln didn't think he could and win the presidency. Lincoln knew of Douglas, but Lincoln had very, very little familiarity or experience with Black Americans, almost none. A little bit, but almost none. So I don't think Lincoln, got up in the morning to say, what's Frederick Douglass writing about in his newspaper, the North Star, as he was gauging public opinion. He certainly knew a lot about it, because Douglas is very, very famous. He's the most photographed American in the 19th century, for anyone that cares. Exceptionally famous person at the time the war breaks out. Then this happens. They meet each other 3 times. The first time, Douglas goes to Washington for a couple of different reasons and decides, I want to try and see the president. And he knew he was well connected with politicians. Politician took him straight to the White House. They stand at the back of the line. Lincoln gets word that Douglas is in the line and shoots him right up to the front. John Hay comes right out and says, Mr. Douglas, right in. And they have a very good conversation in which Douglas is still worried that Lincoln isn't going to move hard and fast enough after the war to end slavery. He's issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but in which he's impressed with Lincoln's sincerity and the respect Lincoln accords him and the seriousness with which he listens. Okay, fast forward a year and a half, August 1864. Lincoln asked Douglas to come to the White House. It's too long a story to tell her, but the brief is this. Lincoln's worried he won't be reelected. The war's going terribly. He wants Douglas's help in trying to get as many slaves now in slavery in the South across northern lines before the election, so he can get as many Black people into freedom, enslaved Blacks. And he calls Douglas for that. But before they get to that topic, Douglas is in Washington. He comes to meet the president. Before they get that, Lincoln says, I need your advice on something. Lincoln's so discouraged, August 1864, Sherman hasn't yet taken Atlanta. Nothing is going well. It's clear he's going to lose the presidency because the war is going so badly. And Lincoln has drafted a letter. He's to a important newspaperman who's then going to take this to the Confederacy and say, I'm willing, Abraham Lincoln, to sue for a negotiated peace that preserves slavery if we can end the bloodshed now. That's how close Lincoln comes to giving up. Very close. But Lincoln says to Frederick Douglass, what should I do, Mr. Douglas? He knows what Douglas is going to say. And Douglas reads the letter and says, you absolutely can't send this letter. It would destroy everything that you've worked for, destroy your legacy, destroy everything that this country can be. Lincoln folds the letter up, puts it in his desk, never signed, never sent, and it's found after the war. That's the first. Second meeting. Third meeting, second inaugural. Lincoln gives us amazingly short, incredibly powerful second inaugural address. Afterwards, there's a big reception. Everyone's invited. Douglas isn't allowed in because he's Black into the White House. Lincoln gets word of it. Bring Mr. Douglas straight to the head of the receiving line. And Lincoln says, what did you think of it, Mr. Douglas? What did you think of the speech? There's no one, he says, there's no one whose opinion I value more than yours. And Douglas says, I thought it was your best speech. Astounding speech. And they shake hands and agree to meet again. And of course, Lincoln is dead in 4 months. Less than 4 months, a month. It's March 4th, a month and a half.
Wow. There's a
If
follow-up.
Lincoln had lived, history would have been different. And that relationship would have been even more important to Lincoln going forward as he forged these plans for Reconstruction, which were in their infancy. We have some documents, but in their infancy when he died.
Wow. I have another question in the chat, and it is, what do you believe that Lincoln would do to address some of the most pressing challenges in the world today, whether it be environmental, the public health challenges, systemic racism, to name a few?
I think the most important thing that that's a tall question. And let's throw in eternal truth and justice, right, as well. I think where Lincoln's ability was so great, and where if I could wish one thing for Joe Biden, I would wish that he would take a page from Lincoln's book and say the job of leaders is partly, it's not just to deal with the problems in a practical, policy-oriented way. You have to keep framing them for your followers. You have to keep communicating them, framing what the stakes are, right? Framing what this moment means in history, and telling each of your citizens what their role is, given those stakes, given those issues, given what's really, what the trade-offs are. That's what he did over and over again. That's what the second inaugural is. That's what the Gettysburg Address is. That's what a really great speech, if you're looking for a new Lincoln speech that you haven't looked at before, that will really inspire you, you need to read the letter to James Conkling, Conkling, September 1863. And there's another one. It's a gem. He was supposed to give the speech in person. He couldn't go to Springfield because of the war. He had his friend James Conkling read it in Springfield. It's unbelievable. Lincoln did that, and we need that. People need to understand what's at stake, especially given the craziness of our information sources, right? The toxicity, the hatred, the selling eyeballs, even in the mainstream media, which is clearly right now motivated much more by selling newspapers and ad copy and eyeballs and airtime than it is by what is the job of the fourth estate in a democracy, right? The press, even the best of the press has lost sight of this. And Lincoln wouldn't let us lose sight of that. I don't care what the media says. Because he's the president, you command the most important bully pulpit in the world. And that would make all the difference. And he would be talking to us in every week. And he would help us understand how to start thinking about these things and how to start dealing with them from citizens up. It was always every single speech he ever made was my fellow citizens. It was always about, we start with fellow citizens. So that would be really important right now.
We have another question in the chat. The Republican Party does not resemble the party of Lincoln. Which politician today, Democrat or Republican, most resembles Lincoln?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a really hard one. I'm not sure. The person who most resembles Abraham Lincoln to me is Bryan Stevenson. Now he's not a politician. Some people on this call know him. He's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. I think why, I don't know him. I've never met him. I've seen him speak a couple of times. I know a lot about him. He reminds me of Lincoln because I think he has this combination of, right, the larger frame, the importance of where we came from and who we are and what holds us together, and then what we owe as human beings to each other. He has this emotional gravitas that Lincoln really grew into. I'm going to read something about this before we pass. I need 5 minutes at the end to read you this that I think really sums up what I'm trying to say. Stevenson, to me, has all those things in a combination I haven't seen in very many politicians. Perhaps John Lewis had some of this. But Bryan Stevenson today, to me, embodies a lot of the essence of Abraham Lincoln. Even though he's dealing in a smaller sphere, but with a huge issue, which began as mass incarceration and has become, right, America's relationship with racial hatred, discrimination, slavery, and how we tell the story so we can move beyond. A version of the huge challenge that Nelson Mandela faced when he became the president of the Republic of South Africa in 1994. Only in some ways a thornier challenge here. Stevenson's really interesting if you've never encountered him. Go Google him and get to know him a little bit. He writes and speaks like a dream, just like Lincoln.
I have another question from the chat.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Lincoln considered only a few individuals true friends.
Yeah.
Could you name a few?
Of his good friends?
Yeah.
So William Herndon, I think, was while they were law partners, a good friend. He had a couple of folks, David Davis, who was a lawyer that traveled with him on the Eighth Circuit. He wasn't such a fixture in Springfield, but Davis became a pretty good friend from Illinois. And later Lincoln appointed him to the Supreme Court, and they got to know, they knew each other socially. Leonard Swett was another lawyer that Lincoln stayed in touch with. William Browning. These were all, again, men from Illinois that stayed with him. Let's see, who else was really important? As I said, I mentioned his wife. Let me just take one quick note here. I want to mention someone else real quick. So just bear with me a second. So when Lincoln got to Springfield, he moved in. He didn't have housing. He went to a general store and said, I want to buy a mattress, and he couldn't afford it, and he didn't yet have any income from being a lawyer. And the storekeeper was a guy named Joshua Speed. Speed was from a slaveholding family in the South. And when Lincoln said, I'm sorry, I can't buy the mattress, I can't afford it, Speed said, well, you can share the room upstairs with me. And Lincoln bunked with him, so to speak, along with several other kind of rotating cast of characters, very common in the frontier for men to, like college students today, or college kids in hostels traveling around the world, to sleep in the same room. Lincoln lived with Speed for several years, and they became momentarily during that time pretty close. Now, Speed went back to Kentucky to marry a sweetheart, and for the year and a half, he was married before Lincoln was married. And for the year and a half before Lincoln got married, Speed and Lincoln had a very uncharacteristically emotional correspondence about the two women they loved, Mary Todd and Speed's soon-to-be wife. And I think one really important, Speed was really, really important in Lincoln marrying Mary, because this man who held intimacy away was about to get married. And a lot of the reason I think he felt like he could do this and make a success of it was that Speed was so happy being married, and that Speed told him that. But that relationship after that, they really stopped being close. Like, Speed was living far away, Lincoln was busy with his law and political work, and it doesn't ever rekindle itself. So it's this brief, close male friendship, and it's the only one of its kind in Lincoln's life. And that's real. I'm kind of now at the bottom of the barrel, a little. That's a little cavalier, but there's not a whole lot more. Again, for a man who met thousands of people and who eventually had thousands of people wanting to be close to him.
Any other questions for the crowd? I think we have time for one more, if anyone.
There's a couple in the chat.
Okay.
One is about, if we were to imagine a world in which he wasn't assassinated, what would we presume would have happened?
Yeah, we historians, economists love hypotheticals, we hate them. So I've thought about this a lot, so I'm gonna just, please don't quote me on this, and I know we're recording, so I'll say this with lots and lots of qualifications or lots of, conditionals. But I think for the limited evidence we have, the truth is that we don't know what Lincoln was going to do with any precision about Reconstruction. We know he was advocating for the first president in the history of the Republic to advocate, may we keep our Republic, I should say, Nancy Kane in 2021. The first president to advocate for Black suffrage, right? So the last speech he makes after the victory at Appomattox, a few days before he's assassinated, he says, Blacks who served in the Union Army should be able to vote. They fought for their country. And that was considered such a radical thing to say that Booth, who's in the James Booth, who's in the audience, says, "That's it. We're not kidnapping him. We're killing this, right? Expletive." And so Lincoln was thinking quite expansively about Reconstruction, imagining what would become the Freedmen's Bureau, which was almost an economic development bank and institution for freed slaves in the South, and how to rebuild the South now on without slave labor, without the labor of Americans who belonged to other Americans. And that he was just beginning to lay this out. But we can imagine without a lot of historical, kind of qualification or validation, that he was envisioning something that today we would call almost, Rooseveltian, right, in terms of a New Deal to integrate the South, and, by the way, to provide a fair amount of leniency for soldiers and other Confederates is a way of bringing them back into the Union. So I have no doubt, if he'd been president, what happened that resulted ultimately in Jim Crow and the terror state that resulted in so many different parts of the United States towards Black Americans beginning in the late 1870s, early 1880s, that would not have happened the same way. That would not have been such a tragedy and such a shame on our country as it was. Not because Lincoln was somehow going to pull magic rabbits out of the hat, because Lincoln was not going to, kind of careen between the two extremes that the country did, with radical Republicans trying to stomp down, the white Southerners after the war, and then pulling federal troops out to allow absolute terror to reign on Black Americans. Terror. And that, I don't think that would have happened. Lincoln was much more deft than the people running the government were between 1865 and 1880, and that includes Ulysses Grant, who was president. Okay, let's pause there. Shall we pause, Hilda? Shall I pause and read something as a close?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so let me recommend what I think is the single best essay on, if you haven't read Forged in Crisis, please do so. It's a wonderful book. And I don't say that to sell books. I say it because I spent 15 years birthing and raising this child. And I want it to have a good, rich life with readers. And the stories are timeless, but it's full of lessons for leading all kinds of leaders, from mothers to chemo nurses to politicians to bankers. Now, let me read something, the single best essay on Lincoln, which you can't easily get, but let me mention it to you, is from a book called The American Political Tradition by Richard Hofstadter. It's a series of essays by a very well-regarded historian, now long dead, of the middle 20th century, named Richard Hofstadter. And in these essays, there's a whole bunch of essays in here, but the one on Lincoln is called Abraham Lincoln and the Self-Made Myth. And I think of all the things I have read, and I have read thousands and thousands and thousands of pages about Lincoln, this is the most succinct and the most arresting and the most apt in a short space. So let me just read you a couple of paragraphs from the end. Lincoln was shaken by the presidency. Back in Springfield, politics had been a sort of exhilarating game, but in the White House, politics was power and power was responsibility. Never before had Lincoln held executive office. In public life, he'd always been a relatively insignificant legislator. Remember, he lost a lot more elections than he won, whose votes were cast in concert with others, and whose decisions in themselves had neither huge finality nor importance. As president, he might consult others, but innumerable grave decisions were in the end his own, and with them came a burden of responsibility terrifying in its dimensions. Lincoln's rage for personal success, his external and worldly ambition, was quieted when he entered the White House, and he was at last left alone to reckon with himself. To be confronted with the fruits of his victory only to find that it meant choosing between life and death for others was immensely sobering. That Lincoln should have shouldered the moral burden of the war was characteristic of the high seriousness into which he had grown since 1854, and it may be true, as Professor Charles Ramsdell has suggested, that he was stricken by an awareness of his own part in whipping up the crisis. That he would go far to explain the desperation That would go far to explain the desperation, very true, with which he issued pardons and the charity he wanted to extend to the conquered South at the war's close. In one of his rare moments of self-revelation, he is reported to have said, "Now I don't know what the soul is, but whatever it is, I know that it can humble itself." The great prose of the presidential years came from a soul that had been humbled. Lincoln's utter lack of personal malice during these years, his humane detachment, his tragic sense of life have no parallel in political history. Lincoln, said Herndon, is a man of heart, a heart as gentle as a woman and as tender. Lincoln was moved by the wounded and dying men, moved as no one in a place of power can afford to be. He had won high office by means sometimes rugged, but once there, he found that he could not quite carry it off. For him, it was impossible to drift into habitual callousness of the sort of officialdom that sees men only as pawns to be shifted here and there and expended at the will of others. It was a symbolic thing that his office was so constantly open, that he made himself so accessible to so many, more accessible than any other chief executive in our history. Men moving only in an official circle, he told Francis Carpenter, the man that painted that cabinet painting we looked at of the different men in the cabinet. Men moving only in an official circle are apt to become merely official, not to say arbitrary in their ideas, and are apter and apter with each passing day to forget that they only hold power in a representative capacity. Is it possible, and this is about to end, is it possible to recall anyone else in modern history who could exercise so much power and yet feel so slightly the private corruption of Lincoln's personal eminence in the human calendar, that he was chastened and not intoxicated by this power? It was almost apologetically that he remarked to a White House serenade after his reelection that so long as I have been here, I have not willingly planted a thorn in any man's bosom. So I think Hofstadter has it exactly right there. Exactly right. And I think we need more men with hearts of women, more male leaders with hearts like women's, and a refusal, who are chastened by power and refuse to succumb to the callousness of officialdom. Men willing to move into great moral seriousness. We could not live in a more morally serious moment than the one we find ourselves in right now. It's a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Nancy, this was fabulous. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the audience. I can't even begin. I wish that I could ask a gazillion more questions. So thank you very much. And have a good night for everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Nancy. This is wonderful.
So powerful.
This is where we miss the clapping.
Yes.
I hope people enjoyed it. I had a great time doing it. And the Hofstadter quote, I just thought of coming up the stairs about an hour ago. I was like, I gotta read that Hofstadter quote. It's so true. It's so Lincoln.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, folks. Well, thank you for all your help. If you're happy, I'm happy, and I will wait to hear from you. No hurry at all, Hilda and Electra, and just let us know when you have the recording. We'll be sure and tweet the hell out of it and put LinkedIn it, get it everywhere. Okay.